Welcome to Sleepy Histories. Tonight, we travel not in haste, but on the slow current of memory, to Britannia. Once Roman, now uncertain, where quiet fields stood watchful, and whispers of change stirred the long grass. The Anglo-Saxons came not all at once, but like a tide, steady and unhurried. Warriors and farmers, seekers and settlers, stepping softly onto foreign shores beneath overcast skies. But fear not, for this is not a tale of blood and fire. This is a lullaby of old earth and older names, of forgotten kings and crumbling villas, of runes etched into weathered stone. As always, be sure to let us know in the comments what city you're listening from, and please let us know what topics you'd like us to cover in the future. Now close your eyes and let the echoes of history hush the mind. In the grey dawn of the 5th century, as mist clung to the chalk cliffs of Kent, like the breath of dying gods, the keels of foreign ships scraped against British shingle with a sound that would echo through eternity. These were not the ordered galleys of Rome, brilliant with eagles and crimson banners, but the wolf-proud vessels of the Germanic tribes, Angles, Saxons and Jutes, whose very names would become synonymous with conquest. The year was 449 AD, though time itself seemed to hold its breath as the first barbarian boots touched British soil. What followed was not merely an invasion, but an ethnic transformation so complete, so devastating in its thoroughness, that within 2 centuries, the Romano-British civilization that had flourished for 400 years would be reduced to whispered legends told in the mountain fastnesses of Wales and Cornwall. The dying light of Roman Britannia cast long shadows across a land already convulsing with change. The legions had withdrawn, their eagles furled forever, leaving behind a provincial population that had grown soft under centuries of imperial protection. In the villa estates of the south, Romano-British aristocrats still reclined on their couches, still read Virgil by lamplight, still believed that civilization was eternal and barbarians were merely an inconvenience to be bought off with gold. They could not have imagined that they were witnesses to one of history's most complete cultural annihilations, a transformation so thorough that their very language would vanish from the land of their birth, replaced by the harsh consonants of Germanic tongues. The invitation that doomed Roman Britain came from desperation masquerading as wisdom. Somewhere in the chaos following Rome's withdrawal, a British leader whom Gildas would remember only as a proud tyrant made the fateful decision to employ Saxon mercenaries as foederati, allied troops who would defend the province from Scottish and Pictish raiders. It was an ancient Roman practice, this use of barbarian soldiers to guard the frontiers, but Rome's iron discipline and inexhaustible resources had made such arrangements workable. Post-Roman Britain possessed neither, and the invitation extended to Hengist and Horsa, the legendary brothers who would lead the first Saxon settlers, was tantamount to opening the gates to wolves. The archaeological evidence tells a story more complex and perhaps more terrifying than the simple narrative of invasion that medieval chroniclers would later construct. By about 430, the archaeological record in Britain begins to indicate a relatively rapid meltdown of Roman material culture and its replacement by Anglo-Saxon material culture. This was not merely conquest, but civilizational collapse, the systematic replacement of one way of life by another. Romano-British pottery disappeared from the archaeological record, replaced by crude handmade vessels in Germanic styles. The Hippocaust heating systems that had warmed Roman villas fell into disrepair, never to be rebuilt. The urban centres that had been the pride of Roman Britain, Londinium, Verulamium, Eboracum, shrank to shadows of their former selves or were abandoned entirely. What makes the Anglo-Saxon conquest unique among the barbarian invasions of the post-Roman world is its completeness. In Gaul, Germanic Franks imposed their rule upon a Romanized population, but adopted much of Roman culture and even the Latin language. In Italy, successive waves of Goths, Lombards and other tribes left the fundamental Roman character of the peninsula largely intact. But in Britain, something far more radical occurred. The Germanic settlers did not merely conquer, they colonized, bringing with them not just warriors, but entire families, complete social structures, and most crucially, the determination to remake the land in their own image. The monk Gildas, writing perhaps a century after the initial Saxon settlements, captured the horror of what he witnessed in prose that still burns with righteous fury. His De Exedio Britanniae, On the Ruin of Britain, describes cities abandoned to the flames, populations slaughtered or enslaved, and an entire civilization reduced to ash and memory. While modern historians question the literal accuracy of Gildas's account, recognizing his tendency toward hyperbole and his particular religious agenda, the fundamental truth of his testimony remains. Something unprecedented was happening in post-Roman Britain, a transformation more radical than anything occurring elsewhere in the fragmenting Roman world. The traditional narrative, established by Bede in his Ecclesiastical History of the English People, and refined by subsequent chroniclers, presents the conquest as a series of military campaigns led by war leaders whose names echo through the centuries like thunder. Hengist and Horsa in Kent, Cerdic in Wessex, Ella in Sussex. These semi-legendary figures, part history and part myth, became the founding fathers of the English kingdoms. Their deeds celebrated in genealogies that traced royal bloodlines back to Woden himself. Yet behind the heroic narratives lies a more complex and disturbing reality: the systematic replacement of one population by another through methods that combined military conquest, economic displacement, and cultural obliteration. The speed of the transformation suggests something more than gradual assimilation. Modern archaeological research has proven that Gildas exaggerated much of the destruction he claims took place. But this has not changed the popular notion that the Anglo-Saxons conquered and subdued the native Britons. Yet even allowing for exaggeration, the archaeological evidence points to demographic changes of staggering magnitude. Burial practices shifted entirely from Romano-British customs to Germanic traditions. Settlements were abandoned and rebuilt according to Anglo-Saxon architectural principles. Most tellingly, the genetic evidence reveals patterns that suggest not gradual mixing, but rather the replacement of the male population. Yet no archaeological or historical evidence from the 5th and 6th centuries hints at the immense scale of violence or migration that would be necessary to explain this genetic legacy. This genetic mystery points to one of the most disturbing aspects of the Anglo-Saxon conquest: its apparent systematic nature. Unlike other barbarian settlements, which typically involved warrior elites imposing themselves upon existing populations, the Anglo-Saxon transformation of Britain suggests something approaching ethnic cleansing. The Romano-British aristocracy, the urban merchant classes, the rural peasantry, all seem to have disappeared from the historical record, with a completeness that suggests either mass migration, systematic slaughter, or enslavement on an unprecedented scale. The linguistic evidence provides perhaps the most compelling testimony to the thoroughness of the conquest. In most post-Roman territories, the Germanic invaders adopted Latin as their administrative language and eventually evolved Romance languages that preserved Roman linguistic structures. In Britain, Latin disappeared almost entirely outside of ecclesiastical contexts, replaced by Old English, a purely Germanic tongue with minimal Romano-British influence. The place names tell the same story. Roman settlement names were abandoned wholesale in favor of Germanic toponyms that reflected Anglo-Saxon agricultural practices, social organization, and religious beliefs. This period is traditionally known as the Dark Ages, mainly because written sources for the early years of Saxon invasion are scarce. Yet the darkness was not merely documentary, but cultural. The artistic traditions of Roman Britain, its mosaics, frescoes, sculpture, and architecture, vanished as completely as if they had never existed. Anglo-Saxon art, when it emerged, drew its inspiration not from the classical tradition, but from the abstract, interlacing patterns of Germanic metalwork and the fierce animal styles of their pagan ancestors. Even Christianity, which had taken deep root in Roman Britain, was driven back to the Celtic fringes, replaced by the worship of Germanic war gods, whose names still echo in our days of the week. The establishment of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms reveals the systematic nature of the conquest. Kent, Sussex, Wessex, Essex, East Anglia, Mercia, Northumbria. These were not mere military conquests, but complete social reconstructions. Each kingdom possessed its own royal dynasty, its own laws, its own distinct dialect of Old English, and its own particular fusion of Germanic traditions with the practical necessities of governing a conquered territory. The speed with which these complex political structures emerged suggests not chaotic barbarian raids, but organized colonization by societies that came prepared to build permanent settlements. The fate of the Romano-British population remains one of history's great mysteries. Some fled to the Celtic strongholds of Wales, Cornwall, and Brittany, carrying with them fragments of Roman learning and Christian faith. Others may have survived as slaves or subordinated peasants. Their descendants gradually assimilated into Anglo-Saxon society. Archaeological evidence suggests that some Romano-British settlements continued into the 6th century, but these appear to have been isolated enclaves rather than representative of broader survival patterns. The conversion of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms to Christianity, beginning with Augustine's mission to Kent in 597, marked another chapter in Britain's transformation. Yet even this return to the faith that had flourished under Roman rule came not from surviving British Christians, but from foreign missionaries, Romans from the south and Irish monks from the north. The Christianity that emerged was distinctly Anglo-Saxon in character, wrong-haying Germanic warrior culture, with Christian theology, in ways that would have been alien to Romano-British believers. The great churches of Anglo-Saxon England, Hexham, Ripon, York, were built not on the foundations of Roman basilicas, but according to architectural principles that reflected Germanic timber construction translated into stone. The poetry that survives from Anglo-Saxon England captures something of the psychological landscape of a people who had torn themselves from their continental homelands to forge new identities in a conquered land. Beowulf, the Wanderer, the Seafarer. These are the songs of exiles, of warriors who have crossed the Whale Road to find glory in foreign soil. The elegiac tone that permeates Anglo-Saxon poetry reflects not merely literary convention, but lived experience. The memory of leaving behind ancestral lands, the cost of conquest, the melancholy that comes with success purchased through violence. The economic transformation that accompanied political conquest was equally radical. The complex Roman economy, with its standardized coinage, long-distance trade networks, and specialized production centers, collapsed entirely. Anglo-Saxon England initially reverted to a largely barter economy, with agricultural surplus and prestige goods forming the basis of exchange. The great Roman cities, dependent on imperial administration and commercial networks, withered or were abandoned entirely. London, which had been the commercial heart of Roman Britain, shrank to a small settlement of perhaps a few hundred inhabitants. Yet gradually, from the ruins of Roman Britain, a new civilization began to emerge. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms developed their own distinctive culture, one that would eventually produce some of medieval Europe's greatest achievements in art, literature, and learning. The monasteries established by Irish and Roman missionaries became centers of scholarship that preserved not only Christian learning, but also fragments of classical knowledge. The illuminated manuscripts produced in Anglo-Saxon scriptoriums, the Lindisfarne Gospels, the Book of Kells, represented artistic achievements that equaled anything produced in contemporary Europe. The irony of the Anglo-Saxon achievement is that it was built upon the complete destruction of what had come before. Unlike the Carolingian Renaissance, which consciously sought to revive Roman traditions, or the Byzantine Empire, which maintained continuity with the classical past, Anglo-Saxon civilization was genuinely new, a fusion of Germanic tribal culture with Christian learning that owed little to the Romano-British tradition it had displaced. The military culture that sustained Anglo-Saxon expansion and eventual unification bears little resemblance to either Roman legionary tactics or Celtic warrior traditions. The Anglo-Saxon warband centered around the relationship between lord and warrior, the symbolic importance of the mead hall, and the code of honor that bound men to their leaders unto death, represented a distinctly Germanic approach to warfare and society. The great battles of Anglo-Saxon history, Baden Hill, where Arthur may have briefly stemmed the Saxon advance, Deorham, where the West Saxons broke through to the Severn, Edington, where Alfred defeated the Vikings, were fought according to principles that would have been alien to Roman strategists. The emergence of Anglo-Saxon law codes reveals another aspect of the cultural transformation. These laws, beginning with those of Ethelbert of Kent in the early 7th century, drew not upon Roman legal traditions, but upon Germanic customary law adapted to British conditions. The emphasis on compensation rather than punishment, the elaborate schedules of Wehrgild that assigned monetary values to different classes of people, the role of the king as war leader rather than divine ruler, all reflected social structures imported from continental Germania rather than evolved from Romano-British precedents. By the time of Bede's writing in the early 8th century, the transformation was complete. Britain had become England, and the Anglo-Saxons had developed their own origin myths that portrayed their conquest not as a barbarian invasion, but as a divinely ordained migration. Bede's ecclesiastical history presents the Anglo-Saxon settlement as part of God's plan for the evangelization of Britain, with the pagan Germanic tribes serving as instruments of divine justice against the sinful Britons who had failed to convert their neighbors. The archaeological record of the 6th and 7th centuries reveals the gradual development of a distinctly Anglo-Saxon material culture. The crude pottery and simple metalwork of the initial settlement period gave way to increasingly sophisticated artistic traditions. The ship burial at Sutton Hoo, dating to the early 7th century, demonstrates the wealth and artistic sophistication that Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had achieved by that time. The gold and garnet cloisonné work, the pattern-welded swords, the elaborate helmets and shields. These were the products of a civilization that had found its voice and was announcing its presence to the world. Yet even as Anglo-Saxon England reached new heights of achievement, the memory of what had been lost was never entirely forgotten. In the Welsh mountains, bards still sang of Arthur and the last days of British resistance. In Cornwall, the old language persisted, carrying with it fragments of Romano-British tradition. In Brittany, British refugees had established kingdoms that maintained tenuous connections to the lost homeland. These Celtic survivors preserved alternative versions of the conquest story, narratives that emphasized British heroism and Saxon treachery, rather than divine providence and missionary success. The Viking invasions of the 9th and 10th centuries would provide a final test of Anglo-Saxon resilience and identity. As Scandinavian longships appeared off English coasts, as Danish armies carved up Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and established their own settlements, the descendants of Germanic invaders found themselves in the position of their Romano-British predecessors, fighting to preserve their civilization against foreign conquest. The irony was not lost on contemporary chroniclers, who noted that the wheel of fortune had turned full circle. Alfred the Great's resistance to the Vikings, his success in preserving the core of Anglo-Saxon England and beginning the process of reconquest, represented the full maturation of the Anglo-Saxon achievement. By the late 9th century, England possessed not merely Germanic warbands, but a sophisticated state apparatus capable of mobilizing resources, constructing defenses, and coordinating resistance across multiple kingdoms. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle initiated during Alfred's reign, represented the first systematic attempt to record English history, a sign that the Anglo-Saxons had developed sufficient confidence in their identity to begin constructing their own historical narratives. The final flowering of Anglo-Saxon civilization in the 10th and 11th centuries produced achievements that rivaled anything in contemporary Europe. The monasteries of Glastonbury, Winchester, and Canterbury became centers of learning and artistic production. Anglo-Saxon architecture evolved from simple timber construction to sophisticated stone churches that incorporated influences from across Europe while maintaining distinctly English characteristics. The poetry of the period, represented by works like the Battle of Maldon, achieved a sophistication and emotional depth that demonstrated the complete integration of Germanic and Christian traditions. Yet, even at its height, Anglo-Saxon England remained haunted by the violence of its origins. The legal codes continued to distinguish between Anglo-Saxon and Welsh populations, reflecting social hierarchies that traced back to the conquest centuries. The persistence of Celtic place names in certain regions served as reminders of the population that had been displaced or absorbed. Archaeological evidence of destruction, layers in Romano-British sites, continued to be uncovered, silent testimony to the trauma of the 5th and 6th centuries. The Norman conquest of 1066 brought Anglo-Saxon England's independent existence to an end, but in a manner that was almost anticlimactic compared to the original Germanic invasion. William's victory at Hastings resulted in the replacement of an Anglo-Saxon ruling class with Norman aristocrats, but the fundamental culture and population of England remained Anglo-Saxon. The language evolved into Middle English, the legal traditions were modified but not replaced entirely, and the basic social structures persisted under Norman rule. In retrospect, the Anglo-Saxon conquest of Britain represents one of history's most complete cultural transformations. In the space of 2 centuries, a thoroughly Romanized province was converted into a collection of Germanic kingdoms whose culture, language, law, and identity bore virtually no trace of what had existed before. The process was so thorough that later, historians would struggle to explain how it had been accomplished with the limited resources that the archaeological record suggests were available to the invading Germanic tribes. Modern DNA analysis has provided new insights into the conquest while raising new questions. The genetic evidence suggests that the Anglo-Saxon migration involved significant numbers of people, perhaps as many as 200,000 over the course of several generations, but still not enough to account for the complete transformation of British culture through demographic replacement alone. The puzzle of how a minority population achieved such complete cultural dominance remains one of the most fascinating problems in early medieval history. The legacy of the Anglo-Saxon conquest extends far beyond the boundaries of early medieval England. The English language, descended from the Anglo-Saxon dialects, would eventually become the world's lingua franca. The legal traditions established by Anglo-Saxon law codes would influence the development of common law, and through English colonization, legal systems around the globe. The political institutions that emerged from Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, the Witenagemot, the hundreds, the shires, would provide foundations for parliamentary government and local administration. Perhaps most significantly, the Anglo-Saxon conquest established patterns of cultural transformation that would be repeated in later English expansion. The systematic replacement of indigenous languages, the imposition of foreign legal systems, the construction of new identities that justified conquest through appeals to divine providence or civilizational superiority. All of these strategies can be traced back to the Germanic settlement of post-Roman Britain. The Anglo-Saxon invasion of Britannia stands as a testament to the fragility of civilization and the power of determined minorities to reshape entire societies. In the space of a few generations, one of the most thoroughly Romanized provinces of the Western Empire was transformed into something that would have been unrecognizable to its original inhabitants. The process was violent, systematic, and ultimately successful in ways that few conquests in human history have matched. As the morning mist lifted from those Kentish beaches in 449 AD, revealing the wolf-proud ships drawn up on the shingle and the Germanic warriors who would father a new nation. The course of British history was altered forever. The Romano-British civilization that had flourished for 4 centuries would leave only scattered artifacts and place names as evidence of its existence. In its place would arise Anglo-Saxon England, vigorous, creative and proud, but built upon foundations of conquest and cultural obliteration that would cast long shadows across the centuries to come. The wolves of the sea had come ashore and they would not be leaving.